just do want to confirm we are meeting again Thursday. Is that correct? Day after tomorrow, this Thursday. Okay, same bat time, same bat channel. All right. Hopefully that'll kind of get us caught up. All right, so chapter 12. This is a pretty long chapter, but some of the ones after this we can get through a little bit quicker. But this will take us a little bit to get through this one. So in chapter 12, we're going to be looking first of all at verses 1 through 14. And here in these verses, we see the institution of the Passover. Okay, so we left off last week. We looked at the 10 plagues of Egypt. And so what was the last plague? Death of the firstborn, right? And so what happened after that?
They got to go.
Yeah, they're going to get to leave, right? Because of what happens. Okay, and Moses had told Pharaoh, you're going to beg us to leave once this actually happens. Okay, so we're still in chapter 12. That hasn't happened yet. Okay, but it's getting ready to happen, and we know that Pharaoh at that point is finally going to let them go. So this observance of the Passover, this is created by God before the Israelites do in fact leave Egypt, before their exodus from Egypt. Okay, so before they left, they're going to have the Passover, and they're also going to have something else we'll talk about, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Okay. And so those will be established. And we do want to note, we talked about, we always want to tie this into Christ whenever we can. So we want to note these things are going to be established before the Israelites leave Egypt, just like Jesus established the Lord's Supper before the start of his kingdom, before the start of the church. Okay, so there's a little bit of symbolism right there. All right, and so God is going to make this in the first month. He's going to create a new Hebrew calendar. Okay, and he's going to tell them the Passover is going to be done during the first month of this new calendar that he's going to create. And this first month is known as Abib. Okay, and we see that, we don't see that here in chapter 12, but in chapter 13, verse 4, you see it's called Abib. Now, it will be called that until the Babylonian captivity, okay, which is going to be some 900 years, give or take a weekend, after this. And after that, it will be known as Nisan, which we think of as a car. But after the captivity, then that first month will be, you'll see it later in later scriptures, it's called Nisan. But it's the same month. So it's the first month of the Jewish calendar, and it roughly coincides with April in our calendar. Okay, and so in this month, God is going to give them some very specific directions. Okay, and what we want to pay particular attention to in these directions is we're going to be talking about the Passover lamb, but how that is representative of Christ. Okay, so that's really what we want to focus on. So I'm going to give you some things here, but also when we get to the end of chapter 12, we're going to kind of summarize. We're going to talk about types and anti-types, and so a lot of things in the Old Testament. That's one of your questions there. Why do we need to study the Old Testament? And one of the key things, and some of you left that out, and it's fine, just make sure you understand it. One of the key things, one of the reasons why we study the Old Testament is because there's a lot of things that do carry over into the New Testament, a lot of things that have to do with Jesus. And so we have a lot of very valuable information here about that. So this is one of those areas where we look at the Passover lamb and compare that to Christ. Okay? So God tells them then on the 10th day of the month of Abib, on the 10th day, each household, not for each person, but each household, must select one lamb. Okay, they can select a goat, but one lamb or one goat, it has to be a male. It has to be 1 year old, and it has to be without blemish. So a male lamb, 1 year old, without blemish. Now, why does it have to be a year old? Well, this would mean in animal years, right? By a year, the lamb is full grown. The lamb is in the prime of life, just like Jesus was at roughly age 33 when he's going to go to the cross. He's in the prime of life. Okay? Jesus, of course, also being a male. What about blemish? Yeah, Jesus had no sin. He was without blemish as well. Okay? So you can see the connection here. So both lambs are male, both lambs are in the prime of life, both lambs are without blemish. So this again is kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Now, something else interesting in here where God takes account of the financial situation of the different Jews. So some of them were wealthy, some of them were not so wealthy. So they were allowed that if your family could not come up with a lamb on your own, you were allowed to go in with a neighbor and do it jointly. Okay, so you could combine your resources so you could get a lamb. So that's kind of an interesting thing that we see there. So you were allowed to combine with a neighbor if your family couldn't afford your own lamb. So the lamb was to be selected on the 10th day of the month. Then you get to the 14th day of the month. So 4 days later, they are to kill the lamb in the evening. So God specified the time. You are to kill the lamb in the evening, not in the morning, not in the middle of the night. In the evening, which by their reckoning of time would typically be between 3 in the afternoon and sundown. So roughly between 3 and 6 or 7, somewhere in that neighborhood. So according to the New Testament, we look at Jesus and his crucifixion. When did Jesus die? What time of day? It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Right, and that's when God tells them, I want you to sacrifice the lamb roughly in that same time period. So again, it's another symbolic kind of a foreshadowing of what Jesus is going to do. And the reference, that's in Matthew 27, if you want to know, but you can calculate that, and it would have been around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Because he went to the cross about 9 a.m., he's on the cross for 6 hours, and so that's where we come up with that. So then God tells them, say, okay, well, when you sacrifice the lamb, I want you to take the blood, and you're going to do what we see here. I want you to put some blood on the door, on the side post, and then over the top of the door. So you see this illustration here. So put some on both sides and put some blood over the top. Okay, and then he gives them a lot of instructions about how to eat the lamb. He wants them to eat it that night. And something that's important, he said, I want you to eat it with unleavened bread. Okay, and we've talked about that. What does that mean? What's leaven? Yeah, he makes it rise, right? So God has a reason for this, of course. So he said, I want you to eat it with unleavened bread. Because for one thing, leaven is often associated with, and again, Christ talks about this. What's it associated with?
Lord's Supper.
Yeah, and it's sin, right? Yeah, and the Lord's Supper, right? So we take the Lord's Supper with unleavened bread. At least we're supposed to, right? Because leaven is often associated with sin. There's also the time element here, as we're going to see. So God said, you need to do this leaven. That takes time. You're going to eat unleavened bread. You're not going to have time to wait for this, okay? So we'll see how that works out. But leaven is often associated with sin. So you want the leaven out of this, okay? Because remember, Christ was without sin, so you get that. He talked about, God tells him to put bitter herbs in it. And most people feel like that's symbolic of the bitter bondage they've been in, which is we're going to see. They're going to tend to forget that when they get out in the wilderness and they start fondly reminiscing about how great it was to be a slave. So, and then something else there, they're told not to dismember it, not to break specifically, don't break any bones of the lamb. And of course, that's symbolic of what? His bones were not broken on the cross, because when they came to him to break his legs, they saw that he was already dead. So his bones were not broken. Okay? So again, symbolism of that, foreshadowing of that. And then God said, nothing is to remain. All right, so whatever scraps are left over, you burn that. And so what we're going to see, of course, is the Passover, the actual Passover itself. That will save them from physical death. Because God's going to pass over the houses that he sees the blood on. Their firstborn will not be killed. So it's going to save them from physical death. And so the lamb is the symbol of that, of course. And obviously Christ saves us from not physical death, but spiritual death. Yeah, eternal death, right? The second death. Okay, so this lamb will save them from physical death. Christ the Lamb will save us from spiritual death. Now, what's significant do you think about them eating the lamb? Do we do that? The Lord's Supper, right? We partake of the body and blood of Christ. So they ate the physical lamb. We, spiritually speaking, we eat the body and the blood of Christ. So you can see how all these things tie together. Now, remember we talked about, the old covenant, and Jesus came and how did he describe the new covenant compared to the old one? Better or worse? Better, right? It's a better covenant. So what we're going to see is this Passover sacrifice. How often does that have to be done? Yeah, every year. Jesus went to the cross how many times? Once, right? Jesus doesn't have to go to the cross once a year. So the blood of animals, that's not going to be a permanent solution to sin. But Christ, if we allow him to be, that can be a permanent solution to ours. You don't have to keep sacrificing. So it's a better covenant. So Christ was sacrificed once for all time. Okay, now getting back to the leaven, like the time element. So God told them, you were going to eat this at night, but you need to eat quickly. Okay, and he told them, I want you to be ready. While you're eating this meal, you need to be ready to travel at a minute's notice. You may literally have to jump up and go. So it's another reason not to put the leaven. You're not going to have time to put the leaven in, okay? You need to go ahead and fix this meal, eat it, and be ready to depart. Because when this all happens, Pharaoh's going to very quickly, he wants them out. And of course, God knows that. So It's like, you guys need to be ready to go. Because as it turns out, when they're eating this meal, God is going to He's going to do the Passover that very night. Okay? And so you look at some of the details, God tells them basically, you need to leave your shoes on. Don't take your shoes off because you're going to have to jump up and go. You need to have a lot of them, shepherd, have your staff ready. Something you're going to take with you, be ready. And he tells them to have their loins girded. And every time I hear that, I think about Barney Fife. Y'all remember that? You better gird your loins, Buster, as one of his quotes, I always think of that when I talk about the loins girded. But what does that actually mean? Yeah, so what it meant here was, again, these people, like you can kind of see here, they wore long flowing robes. That was typical, the clothes that they would wear at the time. And so if you're traveling in a hurry, that could slow you down, get in the way if you did that, right? So this was, in other words, they're going to bind these up. So he's saying, get ready to travel quickly. So bind up your robes so you don't trip over them, because this is not going to be a leisurely stroll. When he tells you to get out, you need to move. So that's what it means to gird your loins. It's, bind up the robes so that you can move faster. Okay. So when this Passover happens, when God does this, we're going to see, of course, that we've talked about all the animal gods of Egypt. How successful had they been against God? Couldn't do anything. Well, they can't stop this either. Okay? And even Anubis, which was the Egyptian god of death, he can't do anything. He can't stop this either. So the Egyptians put a lot of faith in Anubis that he could control something like this, but he's not going to be able to. So again, God is going to be able to show his supremacy over these fake gods that the Egyptians have. So the Israelites will be able to see that, and the Egyptians will be able to see that as well. So God tells them, said, I'm going to come and I'm going to kill the firstborn in every house, as we said, all the way from Pharaoh at the top to the lowest slave at the bottom. It's not going to matter. People and animals are going to lose the firstborn. Okay? But God said, whenever I come to a house that has the blood on it like this, I will pass over that house, and there will be no death in that house. Okay? So that's why Moses tells them all, you've got to put this blood on your house. So the Israelites will be spared the death that's going to affect everybody else. Okay? So in this, we see punishment for the Egyptians. And what do we see for the Israelites?
Freedom.
Yeah, mercy, right? Salvation, in a sense. Yeah, I'm not going to kill you. The wicked are going to die. But if you do what I say, if you follow my commands, you'll be saved from that. Okay, so punishment for the Egyptians, mercy for the Israelites. Now, does God's judgment work the same way today? Yeah. Judgment for the wicked, but mercy for those people that are trying to live right, trying to do what God wants them to do, trying to live righteously. Mercy. How much mercy? Talked about last week. How many chances have I had? Yeah. If I had one a day from the age of accountability, that would mean I've had roughly 16,000 chances so far. So God is very merciful. The first time I mess up, he didn't, well, you're going to hell, that's it. Right, as long as I'm trying to follow him, trying to be faithful to him, God is going to extend his mercy. But there will be judgment against the wicked, those people that are against God. Okay? And so as we're going to see, God is going to set this up as a memorial to remind the Israelites how God delivered them from the Egyptians. That's because the Passover, it's not going to be a one-time thing. This is going to continue. Okay, so it will serve as a memorial of their liberation from the Egyptians. And as we already said, I think JW said a while ago, this is going to be an annual, they have to do this every year, minus one part. What part do they not have to do every year? They're going to have to do the feast and kill the lamb and all. What do they not have to do from here on out? Yeah, they don't have to do this anymore. This was one time. Okay, so because God's not going to come every year and kill the firstborn. This was mainly for the Egyptians, right? So they don't have to do that, but everything else that God commanded them to do, they're going to have to do annually, every year from now on. So God tells them to keep it forever, basically for as long as they are special people of God. Now, is that still the case? No. Why not? Yeah, they rejected him, right? So Christ did away with the old law. They had a chance to accept Jesus, but they would not. And so all that ended when they rejected Christ and he died on the cross. Okay. There's a whole bunch. It's first 14 verses, but that's very important. Again, the main thing is get the connection between the Passover lamb and Christ. That's the main thing. All right, so in this next little section here, we have the institution of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which goes with the Passover. And this is a 7-day feast normally, not this first one, but from then on. It's a 7-day feast during the Passover. We said they got the lamb on day 10, they kill it on day 14. This lasted basically days 15 through 21 of that, still that month of Abib, that first month, which, as we said, for us would be roughly in April. So it would, again, their day started in the evening, so technically it would have been what we would call the evening of day 14 when it would start. But anyway, all the leaven, God said, I want all the leaven removed from every house. There cannot be any leaven anywhere in your house during this time period. And God said anybody during this time period that eats leavened bread will be cut off from everybody else. They will be banished. Okay, so it was a pretty serious penalty. Now, what does bread do for us? Do what? Yeah, I mean, is it part of what sustains us? Well, I mean, in a way, right? Bread, food, it sustains us in a physical sense, right? Again, compare this to Christ. What is Christ? How does he describe himself? The bread of life. Yeah. So again, the symbolism here, this is more in a physical sense, but Jesus is the spiritual bread that sustains us. So this bread is going to sustain them. Jesus sustains us in a spiritual sense. Okay, and that's John 6:35, I think, where Jesus talks about he's the bread of life. Okay, but for the Hebrews here, this is kind of symbolic of it's a new life. They're being cleansed from the sin of leaven during this feast. Okay, and then Moses also tells them, commanded by God, of course, that they're going to have a holy convocation. In fact, they're going to have two. And people might not, well, what's a convocation? It's an assembly. It's kind of like a worship service. And so Moses said, we're going to have a convocation normally on day 1 and on day 7. There will be an assembly of everybody. And God said, on those days, nobody's allowed to work or really do anything at all except preparing the food and eating the food. They could do that, but they weren't supposed to do anything else on those convocation days. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is it talking about the convocation would happen on day 1
of that, and then day 7? Yeah. So
okay,
at the
I just want to make sure it was day 14.
no, yeah, you're right. So yeah, the first day of the feast, and then the last day.
Okay.
So they're going to like begin it and end it with these assemblies. Yeah. And like I said, nobody's allowed to work or do anything except they can prepare the food, eat the food. Not supposed to do anything else. Now, as I said, that's going to be from now on. What about this first one? They're not going to have time to do all this because they're getting ready to get kicked out that night. Right? So they're not going to have time to do the 7-day, right? But God commands that from now on, you're going to do this. But this first one, you're not going to have time to do all this. But he's going ahead and telling them for future this is the way I want this to work.
So it's not now, it's going to be next year.
Yeah. But right now, they're getting ready to get kicked out of Egypt here in a few hours, very quickly. So they don't have 7 days or 14 days or whatever. They're not going to have that. So, do what?
They don't want Pharaoh to change his mind.
No. Yeah, he don't. He will a little bit later, but not yet. Yeah. So, what they're able to do this time, they're able to eat the bread, because remember, it's unleavened, so they didn't take the time to put the yeast in it. But what they don't have time to do, they can't keep the labor restriction because they're going to have to leave. Well, that requires a lot of work. Well, they're going to have to do that. But God allows it this time. He's just saying in the future, it's the way it's going to work. So they were able to eat the bread, but they couldn't keep the labor restriction. They couldn't do the convocations in this one. But God said, I will expect you to follow this in the future. Now, something I want to call your attention to, if we look at verse 17 in this chapter, and it says, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this self same day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall you observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. Okay, so notice here that God said he's already brought them out, yet they're still there. Is that a mistake? Is that a contradiction? People will, well, see, that doesn't make sense. God does this frequently throughout the Bible. So he speaks of an event as if it's already happened, but it hasn't happened yet. So what does this say about God? I mean, is he wrong? Yeah. Right. Is it going to happen?
Yeah.
Book it. It's going to happen. Take it to the bank, whatever, you're right. There's no way this is not going to happen. The Christ was prophesied in the same way, as if he'd already been born centuries before he was born. But it's because it's a done deal. Okay, so whenever God does that, it's not a mistake. He's just telling them this is absolutely positively going to happen, no chance that it won't happen. Okay, it's guaranteed to happen. And like I said, you can see a lot of this throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, where God describes things as if they've already happened, but they haven't actually happened yet. But it's a definite, it's going to happen. Nothing can stop it. All right, then verses 21 through 28, he basically goes through this again. Moses gives instructions to the elders. And he basically tells them this is what God has said. Okay, so he just goes over again the Passover instructions and reminds them again, yeah, we're not going to be able to fully do this tonight because we're getting ready to hit the road, but from now on, this is what we got to do. Okay, so they're told to keep it every year going forward, and that includes when they get to the land of Canaan. It doesn't stop. It's not just for the 40 years they're going to wander. Of course, at this point, they don't know how long they're going to wander. But no, it's specifically, yeah, and when you get to the land of Canaan, this is going to continue. Okay? Now, probably the key thing from these verses is they were instructed to tell their children, make sure your children understand why this memorial is being kept. Right? Because again, when you get 100 years down the road, 200 years, whatever, who's going to be alive that went through the first one? Eventually, all those people are going to be dead, right? So he said, make sure your children understand what the Passover is about, what the Feast of Unleavened Bread is about. Teach them. Because they will not have lived through it eventually. You're going to get to that point. Your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, keep this thing going so they understand it. Now, how does that apply to us? Are we to teach our children? Yeah. Yes. Right? Christian parents are given that instruction. Train your child in the way that he should go, right? Teach your child to love God and keep God's commandments. And we have that responsibility for our children. So that when we're gone from this earth, hopefully they will continue living faithfully, doing what they're supposed to do. And then they have the responsibility, if they have children, they need to teach theirs, and so on. And it continues on. So you see that kind of established here. And then it says the Israelites worshiped and they pledged they would follow God's commands. They're going to do what God says. So we'll see how that works out. Then verses 29 through 30, that's just finally the 10th plague happens. Okay, the death of the firstborn is carried out. It says it was done at midnight. And so normally everybody would be asleep. And we don't know what, it doesn't tell us, but something happened to cause the people to awaken, and they see what's happening, that their firstborn children are dying. And so it talks about there's, wailing, there's tremendous grief going on all throughout Egypt when they see all these children are killed. Now, will that get Pharaoh's attention? Yes, it will. It's about time. So verses 31 through 36, we finally see the command to leave. So Pharaoh gets word to Moses and Aaron, hey, get out. You can take all the people, you can take all your animals, take everything with you and get out. Moses is probably thinking, we could have avoided all this if you'd have done. That's what I wanted you to do a long time ago. But again, God used this to demonstrate his power. But something interesting about this, Pharaoh says, okay, take everything and get out. But then he also wants Moses and Aaron to bless him. So that's kind of interesting. And we see here that not just Pharaoh, but I don't know if it's every single Egyptian, but it seems to be the bulk of them. They all join in this chorus begging that, yes, just leave, just go. Please, get out of here. We want you out of here. Probably afraid of what? Well, God killed the firstborn. Maybe he's getting ready to kill the rest of us. So he's like, yeah, just get out of here. We've had enough of your God. We've had enough of his wrath. Just leave. So the Israelites they had to take the dough for the bread, but they didn't have time to bake it and leaven it and all that stuff. But that's going to mean, of course, God is going to have to sustain them. So again, all this is, God has pre-planned all this because they had to leave quickly. So they didn't have time to take a lot of food with them. They had to get up and go. So they don't, normally if you and I were, we all live here. If we suddenly thought we had to leave, but if we had time, we'd get the U-Haul, pack up, we'd be taking a lot of, but if you had to leave right now, you wouldn't be able to take a whole lot with you. Certainly not enough food to sustain you very long. Well, that's by design because God's going to sustain them. So that they should have no doubt in their mind who's keeping you alive. God is. Okay, that should register with them. So remember we saw earlier where God told them, said, when you leave, number one, they're going to beg you to leave, which they are. And number two, also, what else? Y'all remember what else? Yeah. Said, ask them for wealth and they'll give it to you. So they do. So the Egyptians are loading, they're giving them gold, silver, here, take all my stuff, just leave. Right? So typically, to get the spoils of a nation, you have to conquer them militarily. But the Hebrews don't have to do that. They get all the spoils without firing a single shot, and they just, here, take all our stuff, just leave. Now, what are they going to do with all this gold and silver? They're going to build the tabernacle. That's why. And that's later on in the book, we'll see. They're going to use that to build the tabernacle. All right, so then in verses 37 through 42, we see the beginning of the journey. That's where we see, again, there were 600,000 men, not counting the women and children. And we already kind of did the math on that. I said if everybody had one wife and one kid, that'd be 1.8 million people, but they probably had more than that. And something else that we want to notice, if you look in verse 38, it says, and a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, even very much cattle. So it wasn't just the Israelites. There were other people, a mixed multitude, probably Gentiles, maybe some of the Egyptians decided, you know what, I'm tired of living under Pharaoh. Can I just hitch a ride with you boys? So there were others that went with them. So we don't know how many, but again, I would say surely it's got to be probably 3 or 4 million people, something like that. Virtually guaranteed it would have to be well over 2 million, so probably 3-4 million are going. So as we said, they didn't have any time to prepare anything, but God's going to sustain them. And we're told here that they had been in Egypt for about 430 years. And we see Genesis 15:13, which is a prophecy of this. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Okay, and so what we notice, it's typical for a prophecy to give you a general number. And then in Exodus, we have the actual historical record. It's more specific. So it's 430 years, we're told here in this chapter. That's how long they'd been there. And quite a while to be enslaved. And then finally, we get to the end. I told you it's a long chapter, a lot of stuff in it. We got some shorter ones coming up. We can get through quicker. But we notice here at the end that it was made clear that the Passover was for the Israelites only, not for the Gentiles. Okay? But God did say, if there are those who have been circumcised, they would be allowed to partake. Because what that meant, if they had done that, that meant they had accepted the covenant with God. So God would allow them to do it. But in general, Gentiles could not enter into this. So again, this is, how does that resemble the Lord's Supper today? Yeah. Now, can a non-Christian take the Lord's Supper? I've seen them do it, right? But can they acceptably take it? No. You have to be a faithful Christian. And God said, anybody that does this unworthily, they eateth and drinketh damnation to themselves, right? So, yeah, if you see a non-Christian come in and they do the Lord's Supper, it's not appropriate to smack it out of their hand. Hey, boy, you can't do that. I mean, we're not going to do that. But they're not doing it acceptably. But what you got to do is you got to teach them so that they understand it, right? So, yeah, you don't want to smack them over the head with it. But God's making the point that to be acceptable in how you do this, it's got to be according to His rules and the way that He's set up. So to acceptably partake of the body and blood of Christ, yeah, you've got to be a faithful Christian to do that. All right, so let's kind of summarize again just to make sure you probably already have all this, but just to make sure we compare the Passover lamb to Christ. So both of them were innocent, right? The lamb's not guilty, but he didn't do anything to anybody. So they're both innocent, suffering for who? Well, I mean, they're innocent, but they're suffering for the guilty, right? So they're suffering for the sinners, just like Jesus. So the lamb did it, Jesus did it. Both innocent, suffering for the guilty. Neither had their bones broken. Again, I'm just re-summarizing what we talked about a while ago. Just make sure you got this. Both of them were males. Both of them were without blemish. Both in the prime of life. You think I might ask you this on the test? I think I will. You can just about bank that too. Because it's important, right? We need to understand this. Israel only gained their salvation by the blood of the Passover lamb. Right? You and I gain our salvation only through the blood of Christ. But again, the difference was the Passover lamb was temporary. They had to redo that every year. Once I'm baptized, how often will the blood of Christ cleanse me? Forever. If I sin, as long as I repent, that blood still cleans. I don't have to be rebaptized every time I commit a sin. I have to repent for it, but when I do, the blood of Christ continually cleanses me. Okay? But you have the similarity of how they gain their salvation. Okay? And then we see the Passover compared to the Lord's Supper. Both of them commemorate God's deliverance, right? The Passover was His deliverance of the Israelites. The Lord's Supper commemorates His deliverance of Christians today. No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. So the Passover and the Lord's Supper, the comparison you make there is the Passover commemorates God's deliverance of the Israelites. And the Lord's Supper commemorates God's deliverance of Christians today. So they're two sets of deliverances, if you will. And then the last verse, it just tells us that the Passover meal, the death of the firstborn, being freed from Egypt, all that occurred on the same day. So that was a busy day. Whew, that's a lot. These next couple of chapters are a lot shorter. There's a lot of key information in chapter 12. All right, chapter 13. What we see in the first couple of verses, simply God tells Moses that all of the firstborn, people and animals, they're to be sanctified for Him. In other words, set apart, consecrated for God. Again, kind of in a remembrance, I killed the firstborn of the Egyptians. Your firstborn need to have a special significance. Another way to help them remember what God did for them. So, in other words, I want you to notice that I spared your firstborn. I killed theirs, but I spared yours. You need to remember that. Okay? And so ultimately, then when it's all said and done, really what we have is 3 memorials were created for this. And there they are up there. So you got the Passover, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and then the sanctification of the firstborn. So all 3 of those were memorials for the Israelites being freed, getting their liberation from the Egyptians. Okay? So these are all memorials about gaining their freedom, being delivered by God from the Egyptians. Have I got that? Or I'll still... Yes, no, maybe? Getting there? Okay, that's what I needed to know. Okay, so again, all 3 of these, they are memorials so that they would remember how they were liberated from the Egyptians by God. This is what they're supposed to teach their children. Why? Why do you think God wants us to do that? Well, yeah. Yep, he said so. That's it. But he does have a reason. Yeah. Keep that in our mind, right? Remember what Christ did for you and me. We need to constantly remember that. And as I often tell the brethren up at Etowah, said, yeah, we're commanded to do that every Sunday, but in my personal opinion, I try to think about that at least once a day, 7 days a week. That's just me. Like, I want to remind myself what Christ did for me, because I don't think I can remind myself of that often enough, because you tend to take it for granted, right? So God wants us to remember what Jesus did for you on the cross. So we do that every week. Okay? And you have some groups that'll, well, we just do it quarterly, or we do it semi-annually, or some just do it once a year. Well, why don't you do it? Well, we don't have time. We don't have time. Or that's, well, God didn't tell us to do it every week. Okay, which week did he tell you? It says the first day of the week. Which week? Well, it doesn't specify, so that means every week. But my big question is, why would you not want to do it every week? You don't want to remember what Jesus did for you? You're too busy to do that? What if he'd been too busy to hang on the cross? No, sorry, I can't. Today's not good for me. I can't. Right? I mean, it just amazes me that some people, we just do that every so often. You don't need to do it every week. Well, God wants us to do it every week, and we should do it every week. Now, something interesting in this chapter, look at verse 9 in chapter 13. This is something they took literally, and this is really, it's about putting it in your heart, but they took this literally. And it shall be for a sign unto thee upon thine hand, and for a memorial between thine eyes, that the Lord's law may be in thy mouth. For with a strong hand hath the Lord brought thee out of Egypt. Okay, and so they took this literally, and so they would write these instructions down, and they wore them on their body. But again, the idea was put this in your heart, keep this in your remembrance. But they would put this on their body. And so where we see this continues, and we see this all the way in the first century with the Pharisees. They did this and they exaggerated it. So we look at Matthew 23 and verse 5. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. Okay, the key word here is phylacteries. That's a word we use all the time, right? Hey, what'd you do with that phylactery last week? What? What's a phylactery? Well, these were pieces of parchment that would have scripture or something written on it, and they would wear these a lot of times on their forehead. Because notice it says here, memorial between thine eyes, right? So they would wear it on their forehead, and they would make it really big, the Pharisees would. For what reason? To be seen. Hey, y'all, look how holy I am. You see it? Yeah, it's like a blinking Christmas tree. We can't miss it. Right? So they would enlarge these and make these really big because they wanted everybody to see how holy and righteous they were, which of course they weren't. But again, you see an example of trying to interpret something literally that's meant figuratively. You get a lot of this in the book of Revelation, the whole doctrine of premillennialism. We're going to interpret literal what's figurative, symbolic language. So there's a danger for doing that. But the Pharisees were real big about that sort of thing, and that's where they got it from. All right, then verses 11 through 16, again, God just goes over again sanctification of the firstborn. The main idea, tell it to your children, just make sure they remember it. So he's just telling them that again. And then in verses 17 through 22, they've left Egypt now, and so they're headed off into the wilderness. And God does not take, he's going to take them to the promised land, which is what? Canaan. Yes, he's going to take them to Canaan. But he doesn't take the most direct route. In fact, far from it. Okay? So he's going to take them, but they're going to go way out of the way. They're going to, as we would say, they're going to take the scenic route, except there ain't a whole lot of scenery out there. But they are really going to take a detour to get to Canaan. Well, you think, is that because God didn't know where it was? I mean, after all, God probably didn't have Siri back then. Siri, take us to Canaan. Didn't have Alexa. Right? No, God knew exactly where it was. So why is he taking them the wrong way? Well, he's, as always, God has a purpose for what he's doing. So he has a couple of reasons for this, and we see this in these verses. So number one was that by going the way that God's going to take them, they avoid the very powerful Philistines. Okay? Because they'd been beaten down, they'd been slaves for a long time. They were in no condition to fight a war, fight a battle against the powerful Philistines. And so if they'd gone right through there, and immediately they faced this huge struggle, and we're kind of foreshadowing again because we know what's going to happen, but they probably would have been really tempted to do what? Yeah, let's go back to Egypt. It wasn't that bad, right? So God knew they're not ready for something like this, so he takes them away from the Philistines. And then secondly, this also gives them time to grow in the faith. The longer they go, the more hopefully they'll grow in the faith. And obviously, too, this is going to give them time for God to give the law at Mount Sinai and to build the tabernacle, which is God wants them to do. So they're going to have time to do that by taking this scenic route. And then at the end, we see that they took the bones of Joseph with them. Why would they do that? Anybody remember? from Genesis, at the end of Genesis. Before Joseph died, what did he say? Yeah, he wanted, when you leave here, I want you to take me with you. Take my bones with you. So they do. They honor his request. And then we see that God is going to lead them. But during the day, it'll be a pillar of cloud, and by night, it's a pillar of fire. As God will lead them through the wilderness, and God will never abandon them. So he will guide them, he will guard them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then, just wanted to show you this. We don't know exactly, but the route would have looked something like this. So, they leave from here, Canaan's up here. The easiest way would have just been gone like that. But instead, they're going to go, Mount Sinai's down here. They're going to go all the way, and then they're going to go around here and come back around. And then finally, they're going to get up to Canaan. So again, we don't know the exact route, but it was something like that, where this would have been much easier and much shorter. But God, again, he knows what he's doing, and he has a purpose for leading them on this. Okay? All right, any questions? We didn't get very far tonight because chapter 12 was just so long, but that gets us ready for chapter 14. So we'll stop there, and you saw 13 was shorter, 14 is a lot shorter, 15 is not very long. So next few chapters we can get through those a lot quicker, but 12, it just had a lot of in it. So any questions, comments? All right. Yes, ma'am.